legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Jasun Horsley, who joins us to discuss some of the darker dimensions of the coronavirus crisis. For millions of people worldwide, the routines and rhythms of daily life have abruptly been put on hold. Superficially, the story behind it all, that of a raging global pandemic, is simple and straightforward. However, even official accounts vary from day to day and from place to place, as infection and death rates morph and change, and so-called experts contradict each other and themselves. In an era of 24/7 news, instantaneous global communications and self-reinforcing feedback loops, perhaps this is not so surprising. But this constantly changing narrative is driving increasing numbers into cognitive dissonance as they struggle to support beliefs and worldviews which are constantly being undermined by discrepancies in their daily diet of government and media pronouncements. Those with the temerity to actually question what is unfolding may find themselves casually dismissed as conspiracy theorists. No thinking allowed, end of debate. However, the speed with which the populace has embraced the possible new normal of top-down command and control and swingeing restrictions on personal freedom strongly suggests that what we are witnessing is social engineering on an unprecedented scale. It is the expansion of policies in place for decades, for which we have been primed by propaganda and popular culture alike. Hello and welcome, Jasun, and thank you so much for joining us once again on Legalized Freedom.
Well, thanks, Greg. Here I am again.
Today, surprise, surprise, we're recording this in the midst of the so-called coronavirus pandemic, correct myself, of 2020. If people are listening to this in the future, I wonder what this will all sound like. We're going to be taking a bit of an askance look at some of the issues arising from what's going on at the minute. But in any event, before we start our chat, for people who are coming to this fresh, just briefly let them know who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm a writer and a podcaster. I also run a thrift store in a small town called Hope, and that's, in this particular case, for this particular subject, that's about the extent of my research, to be honest. I mean, just there in the trenches, and not really the trenches, because there isn't much going on in Hope, as you know. But yeah, that's, I haven't done a lot of research, and I haven't written much about this. I did the one blog post which got your attention, thesis of, a controlled demolition of the economy to introduce a carbon-based currency. That was a theory my wife had that I unpacked recently at my blog. But otherwise, as far as my interest in the coronavirus, I haven't done a great deal of research. It seems like there's no end. Once one starts on that trail, one may never leave it. So I really just kept to just local investigation, just talking to people locally to get a sense of more first hand of what's going on.
Well, I think that's a very valuable approach anyway. We've got enough experts out there at the minute from, of all colours, right across the spectrum, informing us that they in fact know exactly what's going on, whether that's the information that's coming to us from the mainstream media or the authorities. And as I said, there's a host of other experts out there who all know exactly what this is all about. And in reality, I don't think anybody's got the complete picture. But I've spoken to a few people about this now, and I think I'm trying to glean as much insight into all of this as possible from my intuition. Yes, of course, from talking to people I know and from observation, to be honest with you, a lot of the time. And certainly, the only expert knowledge, if I want to put it like that I can offer, and this is exactly what's right on my own doorstep, and even then that's limited. So I wanted to just start by asking about something you have actually written a little bit about anyway on your blog, and you've done a few live videos where you're kind of brainstorming and just stream of consciousness about this. Just ask you about your local situation where you are, because I think you used the phrase in something you wrote recently about having an insight into this. For example, someone like you or I could offer would be, quote, a holographic fragment of the collective planetary experience. And, that's a metaphor for all sorts of things about the nature of our existence. But give us a little glimpse of your holographic fragment.
Well, the first way that it's really affected me is in terms of planning. Like, I was planning with my wife certain things, trips to Europe, for example, even the possibility of moving, and we'd started to plan that in early February or late February, right before this began. And so, of course, all those plans have been suspended, and so that's been an interesting exercise, because actually we didn't really need to plan much. If they were going to happen, it was going to be a couple of months still from now, and so the situation as it is just forced us to let go and let God is the expression. Like, well, if it's going to be, it's going to be. And so that's what we've done around that. Just, the one area where it really has impacted us is just, okay, now we can't plan the future. And that seems like a positive thing up to a point, as I say. There's only a limited amount of planning we could do or needed to do anyway. So really, most of it's just waiting to see what happens anyway. And that's a philosophical position, but also I'd say it's quite a pragmatic one too. So that was the first thing. The next thing is we run a thrift store business, so it's just our own business, our own private enterprise in Hope. It's a small shop. It's the only thrift store in town, and the town is about 6,000 people if you include the suburbs, but our client base is probably about 200 or something. Most of the people don't come in to our thrift store, but there's a regular set of customers who do. A lot of them are elderly. So it became apparent pretty early on that this was quite likely to affect us. It just wasn't obvious how much. And some of our staff, we actually had various staff members, because it's quite successful and it's quite tiring work. So we had three regular staff members, actually 4 if you count an elderly person who just worked a brief shift a week. A couple of them were saying we should close, and we didn't feel that we should. So we said, well, no, we'll stay open, but none of you guys have to work. We'll just take over the shifts. And we reduced our hours accordingly. So it was just my wife and I, and it is just my wife and I now running the thrift store. We reduced our hours from 7 days a week, about 7 hours a day, to 5 days a week, about 4.5 hours a day. And what we noticed after the first week, which was probably, where are we now, mid-April, so it was probably sometime around mid-March, where things were really starting to change. It was very slow. So it seemed like for a week or so, oh, this is really going to be bad for us. But after that first week, things picked up. And so that just seemed more like a glitch than anything. And we've actually been making more or less the same daily, weekly income that we were when we had our full hours. So that's been very interesting. The other thing that I spoke about in the YouTube video recently was that although in our town, the official line that's coming through the local media, specifically the Hope Standard, is just it's not a private paper. It's actually run by Conrad Black, who's a bigwig media mogul in Canada, but it's locally run. And generally speaking, there's really very little news in the Hope Standard. But in the last few weeks, it's all been COVID-19, and there's been no ambiguity about it. It's just this is a pandemic, and we have to all work together to prevent it from spreading. and the mayor has been pushing, the standard lines of self-quarantine and social distancing, and for, inessential businesses to be closed, and even used the phrase the new normal. So he's obviously referring to the larger narrative out there and replicating it, and the paper itself is replicating that as well. So if this is what sparked me to do this presentation recently, because there was such a contrast between what I was reading in the paper and what I was experiencing on a daily basis in the thrift store, which is that people were still shopping, that they weren't social distancing. And when I asked them about it, my wife and I, ask all of our customers, maybe not all of them, but frequently we ask the customers what their experience is. Do they know anyone who's come down with the virus? No, is almost always the answer. What do they think is going on? And frequently the answer is, well, they don't really believe what they're hearing, and they think it's more likely some sort of government agenda that is using and or creating and or exaggerating this pandemic situation as a means to an end for social re-engineering. And they have various different theories. I mean, I don't interview all my customers or anything, but I have noticed that quite a few of them do have different theories. But the generally consistent line is that the pandemic seems to them to be very exaggerated, if not false, and that something else is going on. And that's been my view until very recently. And I mean, we can get into that because people have started to say different things recently. And so I have, as I said at the start, the landscape keeps changing, so I have to just keep recalibrating what I think I know, and because I don't know anything about what's going on with this pandemic. I mean, I'm not a medical professional. I don't work in that industry. I don't know anything about viruses. Obviously, this is about as far as from my direct my capacity to directly confirm as a moon landing or something like that. It's very far removed from our direct experience, except so far as maybe people get ill, but that doesn't necessarily prove very much, because people are always getting ill anyway, and we don't know necessarily what the causes are. So, anyway, too long don't read version. Things are more or less, they're certainly not the same in Hope, because a lot of restaurants have closed and bars have closed and some businesses have closed and reduction of hours, and some people are self-quarantining and so on. But it's quite similar. It's not a really obvious contrast. And in my direct life, actually, almost nothing has really changed, except that this thing is going on and I have endless conversations about it.
Well, of course, it's been a conspiracy theorists, well, I was going to say wet dream, but possibly worst nightmare or whatever, but they're having a field day. What was interesting about what you've been saying is that the sort of people that you might have had conversations or exchanges with who are expressing misgivings or doubts, or they feel that things just don't add up, are not the usual sort of person that you would expect, not the guy with darting eyes and, the black helicopter types.
We get those in too, actually, but yeah, you're right. That's the minority.
Yeah, of course, and they're always there, and something like this comes along and they seem to come out of the woodwork, but actually at any given time they're there all the time and everything's a conspiracy, But I feel very much the same in terms of what I said at the top of the hour about my intuition, because I've been here before. We've both been around the block a few times. We lived through 9/11 and lots of other big world events. Obviously this didn't just happen overnight. It started out apparently in China, and it took a few weeks to really fully get us to where we are now. My first reaction was, here we go again. And I thought, this is, there's just not something right about this. And somebody might say, well, if you've ever had any doubts whatsoever about any official narrative, you'll think that about everything. And, it's right to question everything, but up to a point, but obviously not to a paranoid point. But, I personally like to not to take things at face value. And if I read the instructions on a self-assembly piece of furniture, I don't necessarily call loads of people and research on the internet to make sure the instructions are not going to kill me. But I'll do, my own due diligence in proportion to the situation. But everything about this from the get-go has been something's not quite right here. And the difference, I think, between, say, for example, the situation we have now and the other, huge sort of consciousness changing global event that was 9/11 is that even though we had the internet and we had 24-hour communication and instant global feedback loops at that time, that's just on steroids now. And it's made it both easier and more difficult to discern what's going on. If, even if like someone like yourself, you're not really trying to get a global picture, but nonetheless, there's so much information out there, which on the face of it is good, but then there's so much noise and trash, and 90% plus of what's out there is noise, I'm convinced. But anyway, where I feel I am now is once again in some kind of twilight zone, or to use your expression, the invasion of the body snatchers, in amongst people that I know, that I work with, or even people I just see on the street, people who inhabit the same city as me. And it seemed that we'd pulled out of that for a while, and they'd got some light back in their eyes, and then suddenly it was like Twilight Zone again, and everybody seems to be just repeating the mantras. All that jargon that was ready to go, social distancing, 2 meters, self-isolating, lockdown, all that stuff that just appeared to be ready in a box. You just had to throw away the little styrofoam nuggets, unpack it all. That's just become second nature, apparently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do you mean there was a light in their eyes for a little while?
Well, you know how it is. People are, they're dissatisfied with their lives. They think when they're tripping along normally, I'd like more of this, I'd like more of that. But then when something like this comes along, they can't wait to get back to that, cold, hard reality that they weren't liking. I read a comment on something I posted a few days ago, and it wasn't aimed at me as such. It was just somebody reflecting, and they said, I hate my job, but I'd love to get up early tomorrow morning. I'd love to get up at dawn tomorrow morning to go to the office. Mm-hmm. So what I mean is that in between these sorts of episodes, which seem to be kind of gathering pace, in between these sorts of episodes that challenge our consciousness, people seem to get back to normality very quickly. When I say normality, I mean just in their own terms. When I say light in their eyes, I mean there's a flicker of something there. It's not the dead-eyed zombie, the 2 meters, lockdown sort of thing.
Right.
Almost.
But was there a period? Are you saying that it was a period when this first was a crisis that people were enjoying it?
I think so, and I think people have been entering into that experience at different stages, and I think for a lot of people now, it's because this isn't funny anymore.
Right.
If you see what I mean. I think you might have had that experience as well with people that you've heard from or interacted with. Yeah.
So, where are you situated, and what's the state there in terms of lockdown? Are you in lockdown? Are everyone that you know in lockdown? Because you're in Britain, but you're in Ireland, is that right?
No, I'm in England.
Oh, you are in England. So, okay. I do know more or less the situation then. You're basically in perpetual lockdown when you're allowed out to exercise once in a while.
Yeah, but also you're allowed out to, there's nobody actually policing it other than your neighbours and the people in your neighbourhood. They don't have, one of the political undercurrents in this country, and I think probably many other developed countries as well, has been cutting resources for police. So, I mean, there's been probably hundreds of thousands of police officer numbers have been cut in the UK in recent times. So they don't exist. They don't have the people to, police a so-called lockdown. People talk about lockdown. That's a term from prisons. What happens in a lockdown in a prison, as people may know if they've watched any prison drama, is alarms go off and everybody has to go back to their cells and they're not allowed out. It's, when a riot breaks out or something. So I think maybe certainly psychologically you could call it a lockdown, but in physical terms it's not. I mean, every day here there's a little bit more traffic on the roads than there was the previous day.
Right. Yeah, that was the feeling I got as well. So these drones, you haven't heard anything about these, because there was an article about that they were using drones to police people.
Yeah, there was one well-known, well-publicised case. It may have been the only one, probably not, but it was well-publicised. It was the Derbyshire police who had used drones to go into the back end of nowhere and find a couple of people walking their dogs or whatever. But they may have discovered, a few people together, whatever. But anyway, whether it was a good use of resources or not, or whether it was justified, under the current circumstances or not, it backfired horribly as far as publicity went.
Mm. Well, when this first broke, I tweeted something about how COVID-19, how the whole thing was like the biggest story or biggest event about which there was the least to say. And that was my initial feeling, was like something massive is happening, but there isn't really much to say about it. And obviously I've had to kind of go back on that because I've ended up talking about it an awful lot. I've done meetings on Zoom, I've done these YouTube things, I've written a piece about it. So it seems like there's no end of ways to talk about this, but I still feel that a lot of them probably aren't that productive. And one of the problems, I think, is that it's so speculative. There seems to be so much speculation required, unless one simply believes the narrative out there. And as you know, there's the mainstream narrative, which is it's a pandemic and the government is implementing various different means to contain it, and that the economy is going to be hit, but the government's going to, provide support systems for that, and so on. There's obviously quite a lot of ramifications that are acknowledged in the official narrative, but it's all pretty much about how the government is going to sort all this out and just sit tight, right? That's the mainstream narrative. Then you've got the conspiracy, I don't want to use that word conspiracy, but the alternate versions that often do have conspiratorial aspects to them. They certainly have covert or semi-covert agendas. My own blog post addressed a few of those. And they tend to also be quite tidy, like there was the Truth Media video, we're living in 12 monkeys, what have you, which I thought was quite well made, and well argued, but it more or less kept it into a tidy package, which would not be incompatible with David Icke or Alex Jones. Not to disparage those individuals necessarily, but my point is that these narratives, in my view, that are tidy enough and condensed enough and coherent enough that they can be summed up or laid out in an hour or two, are not to be trusted, because it just seems to me far more complicated than that. And so that leaves me in a difficult position when it comes to talking about it, because if you don't speculate, you end up just with questions, really. I mean, starting from viruses, like, do viruses exist? Have they proven that? That's a very good question, I think. But I can't do more than raise it. I mean, I can cite somebody I just listened to, David Crow, who seems to be doing some decent or credible research into this. But, of course, I can't follow up all the research he's doing, right? So you never know. But anyway, just starting with that, like viruses, do we even know what they are and if they exist? But there's so many assumptions that we've got and that are being used as building blocks currently to imprison us, you might say. But there are also many assumptions in the paranoid mindset, which are also being used in as building blocks to imprison us. And maddeningly, that idea that building blocks are being assembled to imprison us is also a narrative, that is being used to imprison us, if you see what I mean. Because if it triggers certain reactions in us, this idea that we're being tricked, that we're being manipulated, that we're being corralled into the New World Order, lockdown, perpetual state of emergency, martial law, etc., and a biometric implant and all that whole thing, if that's used in such a way that it triggers a fight or flight reaction, then we will actually end up behaving in ways that do trap us, whether it's literally in terms of a social system. Obviously, we're not going to create that social system just by panicking, but we can help to justify the measures, but also we can bring about a kind of internal lockdown. And as you're saying, that most of the policing in the UK is about people. People are doing the policing, right? But what I realised recently is that's on both sides, if there's going to be sides, because it's not just blindly trusting citizens policing each other in order, to make sure that they conform to the government party line about containing the pandemic, but it's also the alternate thinkers who say, no, this is the Orwellian future that we always knew was coming, and now we need to make sure that everybody wakes up and protect ourselves or guard ourselves against those shills, those sleepers who are pushing the agenda just by going along with it, if you see what I mean. So then that faction is also both factions are policing each other. So it's kind of like that Milgram experiment, the famous one with the guards and inmates, where basically there's a group of ordinary people who volunteer, and each of them choose whether they'll be guards or inmates, but with roughly the same number, and then they start enacting. I talked about this live action role play, and what they found, I don't know how reliable these findings are, because it was a government sanctioned experiment, so they could have fudged it, but deliberately. But anyway, the official version is that they got so into character that they had to stop the experiment because the people pretending to be guards were brutalizing the people pretending to be prisoners. And so it's kind of like that on a macro scale. We got this society that is, through a combination of psychosocial principles of manipulation and engineering, combined with this, that plays upon this inherent tendency in human beings to get sucked into narratives, to live action role play, to get possessed mimetically by behavior that they're observing, and to double down. Schismogenesis is another principle I've written about, Gregory Bateson, that creates this divide where people find that they have to choose, consciously or unconsciously, which side they're on, and part of that choice is consolidated by pushing against the other side, by policing or defending against the other side. So I think that that's something that's going on, and that one could say that the alternate interpretations of COVID-19 can be just as instrumental in accelerating that, divide and conquer policy as the official narrative.
A couple of things there. The sort of black and white tendency to black and white thinking, either or thinking, which we see on most major subjects, or across most major fault lines in society, is amplified here. People feeling the need to take sides, that they have to decide, what do you think? And this is seen as like not only is it not a time for questions, it's not a time for ambiguity. We see we can't have any of that. Now is the time to see clearly what's happening and to act. As it were, as you just mentioned, whatever side you're coming from. But yeah, you used the term psychosocial, and no matter what's going on with the actual pandemic itself, if there is one, you said a virus is even real. I hadn't considered that. I wasn't aware that was still a question, but I still haven't found out. I don't think it's still been settled as to whether viruses are actually alive or not. I think they display some of the attributes normally associated with a checklist for life, but not all of them. But whatever's happening to people who are actually ill and suffering out there, which, as always, there are people out there right now who are ill and suffering and dying for various reasons. For me, this is a psychosocial kind of event and a political one, and it's that which really interests me, because whatever's driving it, people are behaving in certain ways. Individuals, organizations, governments, they're doing things at the minute. They're doing things differently. They're acting, they're reacting because of this. So even if it turned out to be absolutely nothing whatsoever, literally like a cry wolf sort of false fire alarm, people are still reacting to it. This is why it's illegal to stand up in a cinema and shout fire, because people can get hurt as they scramble for the exit. And I do think it's interesting that I've spoken to a lot of people about, do you know anyone who's been affected by this direct, who has become infected or is currently ill from it? And a lot of people have asked me the same thing. Do you know? It seems like sort of a network of people putting feelers out and trying to discover what the picture is. And of course, although the answer generally is no, or to be honest, has been exclusively no on my part and on the part of other people I've spoken to, it still is very difficult to discern the picture because there's so much conflation out there. I'm not gonna, and I'm sure you don't want to either, get into like numbers, but all the statistics and all the data coming at us, you can find so many different interpretations of it. Did they die with the virus? Did they die of the virus? What was the last nail in the coffin? Was it the virus, or was it their cancer, etc., and on and on?
And on and on. And also that there's many, it's COVID-19, so there's 18 other COVIDs, there's 18 other coronaviruses, and apparently many of those are in the human body, and benignly, and without symptoms, and so then we also have to get into the efficacy of the tests. Are these tests accurate or not? And so that's one more variable. And again, I don't have it in my consciousness enough to even start to list the variables now, but I know one could do a chart or what have you, a map, and one would find so many different variables that are all being converged or corralled into a single statistic, let's say. Starting, as I say, with the whole thing of virus. If we really dig deep, and we can't even be sure about the science behind virology, then really, it's like, I think we're seeing the ways in which certainly narratives are created, consensus is created, and to some extent how those consensuses are self-fulfilling. Because, I mentioned this to somebody in the shop yesterday. This is what I say, I'm getting slightly alternate perspectives now, because 3 people have spoken to me, I think 2 in the shop and 1, I forget anyway, but 3 people, one woman was online, but that they have direct experience working in hospitals or otherwise, and that they are seeing a spike in cases and so on, and that they're, this is kind of second hand, getting this second hand, or for them it's first hand, that there is something going on in terms of deaths. But with this person yesterday, who was kind of somewhat insistent, no, it is real, I found I needed to dial back a little bit and make sure I didn't react to that by just pushing the opposite perspective. And I mentioned that the placebo effect, to what extent the amount of stress that's being generated around this narrative goes without saying, that stress itself can impact, health of people, particularly old people, people generally who are susceptible. A lot of it's around breathing and the lungs. Of course, stress interferes with breathing anyway. The placebo effect, I think, is quite well known. It's highly effective in terms of cures. So it stands to reason it would also be effective in terms of diseases. If you tell people that they're going to catch some killer virus if they're not careful, they might start to generate the symptoms within themselves, whether, whole cloth, entirely psychosomatically, or possibly other environmental factors. And again, back to these variables, how many variables are there on the map? 5G is another one, isn't it? Like, this has just been launched. We don't know. Maybe there are really severe effects from 5G that are observable. It seems likely, in fact, based on what I've read. So maybe this is one of them. That's just, I don't want to speculate or theorize. I just want to keep introducing the possibility that there's so many variables that aren't being considered, and if we start to include them all on the table, then the narrative just collapses more or less completely.
Well, ultimately, at the bottom of every death certificate, you're going to have killed by death. So if they're allowing to happen as what seems to be happening, which is like, okay, that gets counted towards the nightly death toll of this pandemic, then, even just to be on the safe side, that's extremely disingenuous. You can't do that. But once again, it's a case of now is not the time for questions. Now is not the time for, better to be on the safe side. Better to count everyone who dies, who has got some kind of respiratory thing going on as dying from this virus. And then presumably at some point in the future, what do you think? Oh yeah, we'll let you have the lower figure later on. Once we have time to, well, they won't have time because I don't even know what they're doing with all these bodies at the minute, apparently. If funerals are not happening, presumably cremations are not happening outside of, hospitals where bodies are just being shoveled into a furnace. I don't know. We hear in Scotland recently where there's no longer issuing death certificates, or that cause of death was being given by a doctor or other medical professional without seeing the body. Basically kind of somebody on the other end of the phone going, oh, well, tell me, what do they look like? Pretty bad. Okay, COVID-19.
It's really, I mean, one of the things that's constantly surprising me is how quickly people have gone along with this narrative, and in a number of different ways. The most obvious way, how quickly they've gone along with the socio-political mandates. That obviously is surprising, how compliant people have been. But even this whole thing of a pandemic, it's as though people have been primed, and I guess it's not as though we have been primed by movies and TV shows. Not that there've been that many, but there's been enough. And I guess there's a lot of movies that aren't directly about pandemics in terms of viruses, but they're similar, whether it's alien invasion or all kinds of things, where a country's taken over or a town is taken over and people have to band together to fight it, whether it's an invisible threat or a visible threat. It seems as though we've been propagandized with these narratives in so many different forms, including, in smaller number, the actual pandemic movies. I mean, the Steve Soderbergh one was the recent example that was #1 on Netflix because of this. People were watching it. I rewatched it, and it was quite disturbing how irresponsible it was, I would say, in terms of advocating for government intervention and making the World Health Organization seem like the good guys, and just really no nuance whatsoever, no acknowledgement of corruption or manipulation. Anyway, that was just a side point. But how is it that people are so quick to go along with this idea of a pandemic when we don't have direct experience of it, really? Or at least, I mean, there's a sort of double thing here, because in a certain sense we do, as in things like the flu. Every year, thousands, millions of people die of the flu every year, and we don't even pay attention to that. So on the one hand, we do have direct experience of epidemics, but we don't even notice them because it's just part of nature, I guess. But on the other hand, like a pandemic that actually causes, the machinery of the state and the military and all that to come into action, just as in a movie, we don't have experience of that. And yet, now we do. And in a certain sense, we've taken to it like a fish to water. Although, as you say, people are starting to, they're starting to reject the program, I think. Like, this TV show's gone on too long now. It was fun to begin with, but I'm not really buying it now. So I wonder if they're also questioning, well, why did I buy it so quickly to begin with? As if this whole narrative about a pandemic was one that we'd already confirmed, through history. Yeah, we know what to do when there's a pandemic, and now we're doing it, right? It's as if people were already trained for this. It's strange.
Well, they were in many ways, or we have been, absolutely, and not just through previous pandemics and epidemics or terrorist attacks or whatever. But it's that they're certainly a big part of it. But it's the underlying narrative, really, in many ways. It has increasingly been certainly since the turn of the millennium anyway. But we just spoke a moment ago, and I had exactly the same reaction, exactly the same sentiment about the speed at which people went along and seemed to buy into and had their costumes for the movie ready to go. They were wearing them underneath their ordinary clothes anyway, so all they had to do was take those off and they were ready to go. And it was like a trap door had been opened. It went from one state of affairs to the new normal. Boom, just like that. There was no kind of one by one. It seemed to just happen, like literally, as I say, like walking into the Twilight Zone. And he also spoke about some of the narratives in these, apocalyptic movies being about government and the military riding in to save the day, people pulled together. That's one of the common tropes in disaster movies, for example, is people discovering their humanity and their interconnectedness. Now, there's a lot made of that in the media at the moment. There are constant examples of, people making deliveries of food parcels and not hugging old people, because that could be the last thing you ever do to them, but sort of virtual hugs across the interwebs. All of that aside, what I feel, even if it's very low level, it's not very overt or aggressive, but even if it's just simmering there, is divisiveness. It's mistrust, suspicion. It's like The Lives of Others, that movie about East Germany under communism. So there might be a lot of pulling together, but what I experience personally is I feel like somewhere like a grocery store now, like opposite charged, like repelling magnets. I don't know if you ever played around with magnets when you were a schoolboy, and you're trying to push two magnets together with an opposing charge, and how that's what it feels like around other human beings at the minute. Not so much me, but I feel like other people are pinging off me, like I'm repelling them without wanting to.
Yeah. Yeah, I only notice it in our grocery stores. I don't notice it in our thrift store, not hardly at all. As I say, people aren't practicing social distancing who shop with us, and they don't seem to, back away if I'm coming towards them in the aisle. It's a very small shop, so it's pretty hard to avoid even physical contact if I'm moving around the shop. In the grocery store, I do notice it sometimes, and I've noticed quite early on how contagious it is, actually, because as soon as I feel, and it's hard, sometimes it's so subtle, I wonder if I started it, but as soon as I feel that a person is on edge because of this pandemic belief, and that they're seeing me as a potential threat, not personally, obviously, not like I'm a psychopath, but still, I start to feel quite tense as well, and I start to want to keep my distance in order not to trigger their panic response, right? So that obviously that creates tension. That is by definition tension, and it's very mimetic, like how sensitive we are to other people's body language, biorhythms, who knows the various different ways that people communicate. And I really found a lot of mileage in the correlation between the external lockdown and the internal lockdown. I've been blogging about the latter for a few weeks now, and it seems entirely coincidental with the fact that we're in a global lockdown, and many countries are in lockdown now, socially speaking, is this area that I've been exploring about the fascia and the nervous system, and how due to trauma, the fascia freezes, gets fixed in a like a mesh around the nervous system, because it's supposed to be fluid and changing, the fascia, but because of these shocks, it becomes inert, let's say. I don't know the biology of it very well, but and the nervous system that the fascia is wrapped around or coexistent with then also goes into lockdown, and therefore our bodies are constantly tensed up, like we barely ever relax. So that to me is a very important area to look at, like in terms of exploring Prisoner Infinity, the relation between trauma and psychological fragmentation and mind control and social engineering. There's a whole spectrum there. And of course, part of the conspiracy narratives, MK Ultra, mind control, etc., etc. They don't look into much the physiological basis of this, what trauma, how in order to affect us psychologically, it has to affect us physiologically. Like as children, as infants, we are experiencing the world through affect, just perceptually. We don't even have cognitive faculties at that age. So it's not impairing our cognitive faculties, it's impairing our physiology. And I think it's why this process I described with the fascia and the nervous system and this internalized lockdown. So yeah, when I go to the grocery store, it's not as though people weren't already in this internal lockdown anyway. It's not as though people weren't already flinching and recoiling from each other constantly in very subtle ways, because we're all afraid of each other in our current society, because we're so disconnected. We've lost the sense of community and trust. But now it's been intensified. It's more observable, and it's observable if I observe my own nervous system, how mimetic it is. Like as soon as I feel somebody's nervous system tense up, mine tenses up. So it can escalate in that way.
Yeah, I've commented and written recently about what's happening with so-called lockdown and self-isolating and everything is almost just like a hyper extended version of trends that were already in place, exactly people to be spending time on their own, locked away, playing computer games, whatever it is, just a lot of the, social institutions that existed in the past, even something as simple in the UK, for example, as the pub, so many of those closing down. It's all become very, very much about people in their own little isolated cells doing their own thing for various reasons, but partly because it's a dangerous place out there. And, people are not so good at interacting with each other as they used to be. And so much of our social interaction is virtual these days. It is with people we don't know, we've never met, we never will know or meet, but we somehow think we've met them and know them, whatever it happens to be. So that virtual world becomes much more appealing than the sort of awkward, difficult 3D real world that requires some kind of commitment.
Yeah.
And all of that puts us in not a particularly good position to deal with all of this. Normally if you have to go undergo great, not only physical stress, but particularly psychological stress, what you bring to the table in terms of your own mental, emotional strength can make a difference between survival or not. And so it seemed to me, to kind of reflect back what you were saying a moment ago, that we were a species with an already not only weakened physical immune system, but sort of a weakened psychological and emotional immune system. So when this kind of hit, or already some of us were coughing and wheezing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There definitely is there would be a correlation, wouldn't there, between a nervous system that's unnaturally tensed up and can't relax and a weak immune system, because we're not, even say that about the cold. Like if you tense up against the cold, then you feel the cold more, whereas if you relax, then your body can adapt more easily. So that would be the case with countless different things, that the more tensed up we are, the more vulnerable we are in a negative sense, because we're actually trying to keep something out, but we're preventing the body from just naturally processing whatever's coming in. Yeah.
One thing I've noticed regarding this idea of us all policing each other, and indeed ourselves, there's one thing that I've, sort of trend that particularly disturbs me, is not simply those who think they're doing the right thing or are trying to do the right thing without thinking. They just feel that they have to parrot 2 meters and lockdown and self-isolating and, wear masks or whatever. That's the new currency. They're just being good citizens. But those who appear to have waited for this moment kind of all their lives, and there are clearly some people who fall into that category, the sort of brown shirt type, the people the sort of special constables, the special psychic constables, are out there to assist the police in doing their work. I'm thinking a news story I heard today was about, basically, I know you've mentioned this actually, but I can't remember what country it was in, but it was somewhere in mainland Europe anyway, Eastern Europe, and about basically what amounts to nothing less than vigilantes, going around where the police are not, and basically shoving people back into their homes but the idea being that they have some kind of unwritten mandate to do this. Like, who's going to argue with them? And if somebody doesn't like their behavior and calls the police, that the police are going to go, well, actually they're right. And so there's this kind of anti-intellectual celebration going on at the minute, and a lot of people who, a little bit, there's a crossover with the people we mentioned earlier who seem to have found their moment, and those who thought it would be great to live in, a zombie movie or, The Walking Dead, whatever, suddenly finding that wears thin very quickly. I wonder how, and all of the things, all of the potential negative hangovers from this, how those people who felt very empowered or kind of, previously who perhaps were completely powerless or felt that way, how we'll extricate ourselves from all of this. And that's a much bigger question, which I'd like to get to before we finish. But basically, for me, the biggest impact of all this is everything apart from the physical illness. It's, the physical illness itself is probably, in terms of impact, and I know a lot of people will dispute this bitterly, is probably, if not at the bottom of the list, then close to it.
Yeah, well, that's something I just can't comment on. That last thing, except at a meta level, which I tried to, again, we discussed in the shop yesterday. I'm not sure how responsible it is or not, but that, as you've mentioned, death comes to us all. We all die of death, and a virus and even a pandemic is an aspect of death. And So, I mean, there may be, this is such a large subject, isn't it? But it seems to me, I mean, to keep it a kind of basic philosophical level even, but also practical, that the less people are able to accept the reality of death, the more problem they're going to have with a pandemic and the idea of a pandemic. And, Pan is also panic. I'm not sure why there's that correlation. Well, it's the great god Pan, actually, isn't it? Which signified the all. Pan was the god of all in some way, but the response to Pan's presence was panic. So there's something about the pandemic which makes death a collective event, potentially. The idea is it could wipe out the whole species. Obviously that amplifies people's personal fear of death, but it also takes it to another level entirely, I think. But there's a weird dichotomy there, or there's two sides to that, because I think many people do like the idea of living in the end times or the apocalypse. If everybody dies, it'll be much easier for them to die. So I think there's a mental level at which it's quite exciting, this idea that the population might be decimated and the streets will all be abandoned and it will be like 28 days later and so on. This feeling that there's too many people, and that feeling is an experiential one. It's not just a bad attitude, or it's because we don't have community, we don't have a feeling of connecting to each other, and the more people there are around us, lonely in a crowd, right, the harder it is to connect. We know that on an experiential level. If you go out with 30 people, it's pretty hard to connect to all of them. Certainly if you're all trying to have one conversation, like at a big dinner table, it's not going to happen, whereas it's one-to-one, you can connect. So there's something about, it's not just overpopulation, because that's an idea. We don't really know how many bodies the Earth could support if there was a different system, but it has to do with the system that we have, which on the one hand turns people into kind of automatons who are just part of a machine-like society, and on the other hand it connects us all together in this superficial, literally machine sense. So we have a growing sense of being part of a huge population that we're connected to only in a superficial way, but not at all in a deep way. Like there isn't empathy or trust or love between us and those 8 billion individuals that we're made aware of, or even between the people in our neighbourhood, especially if we live in London or a big city. So then, I'm not sure I'm going with this because it's such a large subject, but this possibility that death is something that's coming for all of us, which of course it is individually and collectively too. Like everybody who's alive now will be dead, and everyone who's ever going to be born will eventually be dead. So by that logic, eventually everybody will be dead, right? Eventually the Earth will die, or the sun will die, or something. But short of transhumanism or heaven, not to put those two, make them equivalent, but short of a metaphysical endpoint or some crazy scientific one, essentially we were all on that zero curve, or whatever it is in Fight Club. Everything ends with death. And I want to try and tie this back to some of the things you said, but as I said, it's very large, so I'm just talking all over in many different things here. But one of the things that I think increases our fear of death is our lack of embodiment, and our reduction to just a mental sort of compartment of an identity. The transhumans call it a beeman. If all we are our opinions and our beliefs and our memories, that's the thing that absolutely is going to get wiped out, and that kind of has no reality in and of itself anyway. So there's some inherent terror in that, and that's also our isolation, our sense of isolation. Whereas as human bodies, first of all, the body knows death. It knows about death because it's built into it, and so I don't think the human body fears death. How could it? Why would it? It has adrenaline in order to avoid deadly situations, but that's not the same as living in fear of death or having some philosophical fear about death. That's a very different thing. And secondly, as human bodies, we're aware of our connection, just like trees or bees or ants or anything else in nature. We're all deeply interconnected at a physiological level. And so there would be something in that, well, death isn't the end, even in a physical sense, because other parts of the collective human continue, whether we have descendants or not. So yeah, having lost that, I think we're getting forced further and further into a sort of panic room of our own identities, which, as you were saying, is emphasized, was already happening, but now it's been accelerated by the voluntary self-quarantining, which involves also a voluntary symbiosis with the technology, whereby we live more and more through our technology. Although, like you and I now, although we still connect through the technology, it's a different kind of connection that's much safer, much less embodied, and actually includes connecting to, nobody at all, watching porn or playing video games or watching Netflix. There's nobody on the other end of those channels, right? They're just simulacra. Mm-hmm. So they don't lead anywhere, but they do keep out the terrifying awareness of other human beings, of our own body. I mean, it's weird, but I would say our own bodies have become terrifying to us in some way, probably because of all the trauma in them, and also because they're going to die. That our bodies remind us that we're going to die, and the pandemic sure as hell does that. So, I mean, we could get into this, like terror management theory and so on. That's Sheldon Solomon, I think, Ernest Becker. This whole thing, like the fear of death, if it's used in the right way, will trigger human beings into all kinds of behaviors that they wouldn't. They will buy stuff they wouldn't buy. They will do things they wouldn't do. They will make decisions they would never make. They will have emotions they wouldn't normally have. It's such a powerful lever for social control. So a pandemic, as I say, that takes it to a whole other level. And yeah, I think they've got this narrative that's bringing out the best in people. But yeah, I don't believe it. I think that's only true if we're really, I mean, it might be true in communities, and I'm not saying there isn't that aspect of it, but to bring it back, if I can finally, to my own experience, that is all I've got. So although I can't say there isn't a pandemic, I can say that the pandemic hasn't arrived where I am currently, and that, well, I can't say I'm not afraid of death, but I don't have a problem with death. And so if the pandemic comes, then I'll just deal with it. It's just maybe it's part of nature, or maybe it isn't, but it's certainly it becomes part of existence. And I have to rely on my own, like you were saying about you buy a thing and you've got instruction manual. Well, you don't necessarily just follow it, right? Maybe you can put it together yourself. That's my way. I'll use the manual if I need it, but I don't just think, I should follow the manual like a robot. So I don't know how I would respond to a pandemic or whatever, to a local epidemic. But maybe I'll find out. But I would want to find out by responding, not by following some social mandate. And that's what people are being prevented from doing. They're just being given the ABCs, and if you stick to them, you'll survive, right? It's like the Terminator, come with me if you want to live kind of thing. And, people are afraid enough, they'll just obey robotically. But they won't, that's only in their minds. Like if their bodies are feeling something else and trying to respond in other ways, they're having to suppress that, go into lockdown and so on, then there's going to be a corresponding reaction against that. And so we maybe would see that in the population. You've got a whole bunch of people who are meekly complying, and then you've got this other maybe smaller demographic that are kind of saying fuck this shit, but then don't. Well, they've got protesters now, so there is that too, but then there's the guys that want to be vigilantes. They want to live this drama, this narrative, and live action role play it, but not just by hiding at home and watching Netflix, right? So then they get to patrol and parole and be in that particular role and to manage their own terror, in more aggressive ways.
I know some commentators, people whose work I respect, and I follow what they have to say on the big questions of the day, and there's certainly more than one who are not refusing to address what's going on at the minute, but they're not terribly interested, and I understand why. Because on one level, it's just the next thing, really. But whatever sort of physical or psychodrama the people individually or collectively find themselves caught up in the moment can be all encompassing. So I well remember 9/11 happening. I remember the day getting up, working from home at the time, and I didn't turn on any radio or television until lunchtime. And when I did, lo and behold, this is what was happening. And I remember what happened during the rest of the day. I met up with some colleagues, business things, and one of them was listening to the radio all day and going, I'm scared. I'm really scared of what's going to happen next. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of people, most people probably right across the world, for quite a while after that, particularly in that sort of that moment, like, when you fire a gun and all the oxygen's been sucked out of the air until it returns, there's that, what's going to happen? Just that feels like a split second, or it's a split second, but it feels like longer. Basically, probably until the American troops went into Afghanistan, when you could actually see, okay, something's happening now, there's some kind of response. Everybody was like so afraid, but for a long time after that, it was like the future of the world is now going to be dictated by the response to this terrorist attack. Everything about our lives is going to change. 9/11 changed everything, man. And for a while it did seem like that, but then at some point it became just another, not footnote quite, but it became another historical event. I
suppose, but it also became the new normal, didn't it?
It did. Well, yeah, there's two dimensions to this. It did become the new normal in many ways. Some of people's worst fears were not manifested, did not come to pass. But yeah, one of my concerns about what's happening now is what we're going to be left with. That's the thing. If personally, aside from getting ill, then the thing that concerns me the most is what we're left with after this. What gets put in place, whether it's people's individual psychology, or whether it's collectively, or whether it's on a more practical level to do with the systems we depend on, economics, politics, restrictions on our freedoms. That'll be the real reckoning in all of this. And we know that, again, something that we've seen in the wake of past events of maybe not on comparable scale, but sort of they felt as bad at the time, was that anything under the rubric of the new normal can be ramped up at any time. So we can all think of the airport security that was put in place after 9/11 that we're still living with, even though some of it, like taking off your shoes, it can all be traced back to the shoe bomber, which was never practical, never could have happened anyway. So at some point in the future, at any point, a government could conceivably say, the World Health Organization, whoever, could say, oh, we've had a few cases here, lockdown, or there's a new outbreak, lockdown. And people may initially, certainly anyway, be less likely to question that, say, oh, hang on a minute, are you sure? Because it'll be the reflex action. It'll be batten down the hatches. Yeah. And even if you don't take it away from an official capacity, I think there's going to be people social distancing for a long time to come, just doing their own thing, as it were, freelancing. There's going to be people going on 2 meters lockdown, social distancing, mumbling under their breath as they shuffle along the streets. There's going to be somebody who's going to cough in a checkout line at supermarket this time next year, and it'll be evacuate,
Well, we haven't even got into the economy. Not that I'm, knowledgeable to talk about the economy, but it doesn't take much to see that there's going to be massive, or there are already massive repercussions in the economy, and to what extent is the economy? I mean, I'm not sure I'll be able to articulate this, and I wrote very little bit about it in the Vice of Kings, which is the first time I'd heard of John Maynard Keynes, was researching that and the Fabian Society, and how he was the brain behind the modern economy very much. And there's something about how the economy, and you trace this all the way back, almost in a philosophical way, to, that devolution or degeneration from, gold to paper and now all the way to digital. And what's next? What's the next iteration in the cashless society? A new currency, I suspect. As I say, possibly one that is backed by carbon, which is a negative currency. And the convergence there between what might be called an idle economy, as in, to be part of the new carbon-based economy, you have to be idle, you have to do nothing, and let our rulers, run industry and enjoy the parks and have the planet of their playground. You get to stay at home and earn carbon credit points by doing nothing, right? So, but actually wasn't where I was going to go with this, was that I think that there's been an evolution or a social progression, I think, via the, how can we call this, the economization of society, it's a social economy by which more and more it goes without saying that the world is, money makes the world go round. The economy is what shapes the world. And the world is what shapes us as individuals. And I think the end point of this, metaphorically speaking, is to turn human beings into currency so that they can be moved around like numbers. And as I said, that's quite an abstract idea, although it does take us right into matrix territory. And so, but anyway, we put that sort of on the shelf now just as a model to try and talk about a big picture. Then, if you want to radically reconfigure society and the way that human beings move in society, then you start with the economy, or the economy is kind of the core of that. And that seems to me what is likely to happen. Like, yes, we can talk about the political infringements on freedom and so on and so forth, but a large part of it that perhaps many of the more paranoid folk or the conspiracy theorizing folk aren't necessarily seeing or acknowledging is that it's not going to be enforced. It'll be enforceable, but it won't have to be enforced because there'll be such compliance. And so then we can see how we have been primed, not just for a pandemic and for these kind of measures that we're seeing, but also for something like universal basic income, for example. The socialist kind of underlayer to socio-political changes over the last 100 years. And now, of course, the environment, the massive thing. How Extinction Rebellion seemed to lead sort of organically on to COVID-19, or at least for me. The last thing I was looking at on a large scale social engineering levels was the Extinction Rebellion. What's all that about? And this very strong green agenda that was saying, we need to stop society the way it's going and bring it to a halt. And then suddenly society is brought to a halt by this. And it seems to me, and there are documents of this, I include them in my piece at the blog, that have suggested, well, number one, that there was an economic clash was predicted for 2020. So I've used the analogy of controlled demolition. If a building's coming down, then you don't just wait for it to fall down. You set up the charges and you quarantine it, if that's the word, cordon it, so that you have control of the demolition. So there's that it was anticipated, but also documentation that if we're going to reconfigure society in a way that's more environmentally responsible, and I put that with scare quotes because I believe that it's all pretext, but anyway, that appears more environmentally friendly, then what are some of the possible means to that end, or what are some of the circumstances that might facilitate bringing about such an end? And the pandemic was one of them, was considered for that. So there does seem to be a convergence of interest there, and of whatever we'd call that, more than social trends, because they're things that are just inevitably happening and that can be anticipated. I'm pretty sure that people who know about the economy, who saw what happened in 2008, certainly they knew it was going to happen again, and it probably wasn't that difficult to map to some extent, when it was likely to happen and how and why and where. And then ditto with other things in terms of, how to introduce new social regimes and policies and possibly a new currency in such a way that people will accept it. What are some of the potential elements that can be used to create a narrative or a context in which those agendas can be unfold. Now, I'm quite wary about talking about the big picture because I know how quickly it becomes the alleged conspiracy theory, because that's what people hear. I know that people will listen to this and they'll hear it and they might not think this sounds like a conspiracy theory because they might be sympathetic, but they will kind of think of it in that context that they're familiar with. But I don't see this as a conspiracy per se. I don't think it's secret. I don't think it's criminal. It's social engineering, and we can see how social engineering unfolds, at least with hindsight. 2020 is hindsight, right?
No, I get what you're saying about conspiracy, and I totally agree. People will hear what they want to hear up to a point. But what you're saying is perfectly plausible, and some of the things that concern me that I've already mentioned that you've just also reflected are the idea of some kind of social credit system, where we get points for good behavior, like they have in China. The idea that travel will be limited. Perhaps there might be a scenario whereby you would need to get inoculated or vaccinated in order to get a certificate to allow you to travel, a bit like just getting a passport. That's perfectly feasible in the light of what's happening at the minute. A lot of people would see that as not unreasonable. The idea of universal basic income. For people who don't know, that's a basic amount of money just given to you, like being on the dole, but not couched in such negative terms. So, $1,000 or £1,000 or 2,000, whatever, per month, guaranteed to everybody, no matter what your income is otherwise. The idea being that you can basically get by. You can live in a micro apartment and eat micro amounts of food and just exist on that money. Anything above that is a bonus. And then the idea also of a purely digital currency based on whatever it happens to be, but it would be a cashless society, which again, even at the most basic level, makes a lot of sense now, because one of the first things that I noticed happening when all of commerce was still up and running just over a month ago was that people were putting out little signs saying card payments only, because cash was seen as a method of infection, a potential route of infection. So those bullet points I've just listed, they fit in with one or both of the overarching agendas that you mentioned, which was some kind of economic reset. A collapsing system. It just needs to be rebooted, and that's been the commentary on that since the financial crisis of 07-08 has been constant and increasingly shrill. And then the other idea of there being all of these incentives and campaigns and regulations designed to reduce our carbon footprint, to reduce consumption, to make it the human enterprise to shrink that down. Lots of people have that as a legitimate goal. I know many people, myself included, I could see how that might have benefits for the planet. So all of that stuff could feed into either or both of those. So to just relegate it to the realm of conspiracy is just lazy, because and this is why I'm watching all of these things at the minute, because I think it's entirely possible that we'll go down one or more of these routes as a way to achieve one or both of those major goals. That's what I'm expecting, actually. If I was a betting man, I'd put a few quid on that.
A few carbon dollars. Yeah, I mean, it's the history is coherent, doesn't require conspiracy. I mean, the agendas unfold, and that they involve groups and individuals and philosophies and methodologies and systems. I mean, it's self-evident, and that they involve conspiracies too. Conspiracies are one part of it, but they're only one part. I mean, conspiracy in the technical, literal sense of people coming together in secret, plotting things that are unconstitutional or criminal, let's say. That's the technical definition of conspiracy, which of course goes on all the time in all countless different fields. You only need 3 people to constitute a conspiracy, right? So in a certain sense, we underestimate, even the most paranoid underestimate just how prevalent conspiracy is. But of course, conspiracy theory today has more or less become equivalent to a grand conspiracy, which is just manipulating global developments of global geopolitics, just in a unified way, and it certainly does tend to ignore the aspect of geopolitics which is nation states warring for power, and even factions within nations warring for power, and factions that are independent of nations, and so on and so forth. Needless to say, it's just a massively complex subject, and one that I'm trying to gradually withdraw from. But one doesn't really need to be overly informed or to try too hard to make sense of that whole can of worms, to see and to and or imagine, a bit of both, that that society does evolve or devolve or degenerate or shut down or calcify, which I think is close to what we're seeing, in a coherent fashion, just as other organisms. Not that society is an organism, but it is created out of an organism, as in the planet, by organisms, human beings. So it's certainly semi-organic society, and I would say that that's the big picture, not some global elite or hidden interdimensional reptilians or extraterrestrial overlords or angelic demonic influences. All those things could be in there, or they might not be, but that human society would proceed in a coherent fashion that can be mapped, both after and before, if you see what I mean by that. Mm-hmm. Is not improbable at all. In fact, I think it's inescapable. It's actually, to me, it seems logical. Everything else in nature we can see has a coherent kind of life cycle. So the same applies for society. So, and it's interesting because when we talk about the minutiae, like what's the currency going to be, and what's going to happen to the economy, and what kind of new laws are passed, to try and then see them in the context of some design, suddenly it's like, oh my God, it's a conspiracy. But actually, you could say that that's because we haven't pulled back far enough. Because if we've pulled back far enough, we might see, oh yeah, look, there are conspirators, there's Rockefellers and all the usual suspects are in there. But there's the planet Earth as well, the ecosystem, and even the solar system, and it's all sentient, and it's all moving in some way towards some end. And so yes, of course it's coherent. Like, life isn't random. I don't know if anyone but Richard Dawkins and his cronies believes that. It's just, it's oxymoronic to say that life is random, I think. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of my message, if you like, is that the dark mechanisms of social engineering, they are real, but they are embedded in a much larger context, which is kind of actually explains how they happen, but it also, in a certain sense, redeems them. Not that they're not destructive and anti-life, they are, but they are still somehow inseparable from a much larger process we call life itself. We're just in the dark about that currently, very much in the dark, I'd say.
Yeah, and they're not apart from us. That makes, again, that's creating an us and them dichotomy, but in that sense, we're all part of the same thing, like life itself. So I think we don't really have time to get into it, but we could start talking about, our shadow. Jung said, that which is, denied in the psyche, it manifests itself in the world as an event, something along those lines. What we try and suppress rises up somewhere else, and we see that, people like making themselves physically ill through stress, for example. So it's like these things are intimately bound together. And so we're part of what's unfolding at the minute. And, maybe we could use that to end on a positive note, because as far as the conspiracy thing goes, I want to influence the future path of human race and the life on the planet. Yeah, I would like to do that, please. I'd like to play a part in that. Does that make me some kind of control freak or, conspirator?
Well, you can't not, can you? We can't not have some influence, so let it be a conscious one that is we're transmitting love and awareness rather than the opposites. I mean, I'm not saying we can just choose that. We can just say, I'm going to be loving, but we can be aware. The more aware we are, more empathically we are aware of not just the influence of the environment and of others on us, but vice versa, of our influence, our impact on others and the environment, then the more we'll see the stuff we don't want to see and actually become more conscious of that shadow, as you say, which is always expressing, including in inactivity. I mean, that's the cliche, isn't it? All it takes for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. Well, that's a bit of a dichotomy there, but the basic principle I see and I agree with. I would add to that and it's probably a fitting metaphor, that when we talk about the shadow, whatever's going on in the world that we haven't processed internally or made conscious, plays out as an event around us. That's our own shadow occurring. It's a similar principle to the physiological principle that if there is imbalance in the body, then it will come out as symptoms. And if we fight those symptoms simply as something that we want to get free of, we might fill ourselves with drugs, and we might manage to somehow neutralize them or just put the body to sleep to such an extent that we don't feel the symptoms anymore. But one thing we certainly won't do is understand what caused the symptoms, so we won't be addressing the imbalance. We'll just be addressing, the effects of some hidden cause. So that seems to be the way to reach a positive perspective here, is to see what's happening around us as a reflection of something internally, and then redirecting our attention internally. Recently I had the thought that it's like a will stigmata, as in the human body is manifesting some internal condition on its skin, and so then we're seeing, like the dark side of crop circles, we're seeing this pattern emerging, this like a chrysalis really of this global lockdown, if we want to call it that, the New World Order, as it's been branded, it is something that's emerging from the body like a tattoo on the surface of the planet, and there's a potential from that to fully acknowledge our pathology. And if you become aware of a pathology, then you're halfway to getting free of it.
Well, closing thought from me is, I've read so many books, listened to so many people over the years, thinkers from so many different perspectives and so many different philosophies, who wanted to see the world change, convince us that the world could change for the better, and that we're part of an evolutionary process, and that at any given time, how people saw the world, good or bad or indifferent, was a lot to do with their own perspective. But there were trends that you could map, and this people talking about wanting a new world, and it occurred to me that in many ways, now you've got one. Anybody listening to this, you wanted a new world, now you've got one. Isn't what you were hoping for, isn't what you thought it would be. Well, Age of Aquarius not quite panning out how it was supposed to. Well, maybe this is actually the 2012 that all those people were spending their time on hilltops or waiting, in the sunrise. But for my part, this isn't what's happening now isn't the counsel of some sort of apathy or despair. If anything, it's for me personally, it provides sort of motivation to re-intensify what I'm doing, to look again, at my beliefs and preconceptions and perceptions, and think about, particularly as the years go by, what do I now want to do with the rest of my life? And that might sound like very sort of wrapped in cotton wool and wishy-washy and like nebulous, and what are you talking about? But I feel that the best way to put it, I think, is that I just feel that the present moment seems very important. despite what I said earlier about it being just the next moment, like the next punctuation point in history, it still feels like it's important, and that's me based on not on watching the news or looking at numbers of people being ill, but on how I feel, what I sense.
Yes. Well, I mean, I've noticed quite a bit of optimism and good feeling. I think it's a kind of closure to a certain extent. And for me, it coincides with the end of a period or a process or a project that I call mapping hell. I mean, the final stages, I put a name to it. The last few books I've written, and this latest one that I'm about to self-publish is called Maps of Hell, as an acknowledgement of that process. So yeah, for me, something coming fully into form that I always suspected was there, it is a liberating experience. And yeah, it does intensify the focus, just as the idea of death does, and particularly, mass death or collective death. That provides very clear contrast, a much clearer contrast in my awareness in terms of what it is that I actually want to do with my life while I still have it. And yes, it is a bit of a cliche, but only because so many people have said that and never really meant it. And it really is very hard to get to a place of fully recognizing without a panic response that our time is running out, our time is very short, possibly for humanity entire, because I do think that this is driving home something true, even if it's by false means, as in, even if there isn't a pandemic, I do think it's fair to say, or to at least wonder if humanity isn't on the verge of complete destruction at this time. I do think there was evidence for that well before this supposed pandemic. So I think maybe it is reflecting some inner sense that we can't go much further down this particular tunnel that has no light at the end of it. Anyway, so yeah, for me that there is a lightness and a letting go and the promise, or even the first intimations of liberation, which I've described in the metaphor of mapping hell. Like once I feel that I've really completed a map of hell sufficiently, to represent the territory, then there's a realization in that, which we can't get into because it's very philosophical, but metaphorically, it's like, well, the exit's included. That's how I know it's complete. And now I see that hell is built this way. Now I see that how I entered into hell, and once I see how I entered into this hell, then I know the way out. So then it's just time to start moving towards that exit. And that is a very good feeling, even though you still have to go through hell to get to it.
Jason, no doubt we'll come back to this. In the meantime, your books are easily available all over the internet. Before we sign off, however, tell listeners just about your website. They can also find your podcast there, of course, and lots of other resources.
Yeah, auticulture.com. That's AUTI culture.com. I'm doing a regular blog series around my collaboration with Dave O'Shana, who's an interesting character that we haven't talked about, but anyway, that's a lot of my stuff at the blog is around that now. The podcast is a mixture of things still. That's the liminalist, the podcast between. I'm also doing live meetups, currently on Zoom, although it's not ideal, but anyway, online video meetups, groups. And I'm about to, I think, mount a fundraising campaign for Maps of Hell, which is a book about Hollywood, secret society, superculture, and psychological warfare, which absolutely nobody wants to publish, much to my surprise. So yeah, I'll probably just be self-publishing that, so I'll be trying to raise enough money to cover the costs for that, probably starting in the next couple of weeks.
Splendid. Well, once again, Jason, thank you so much for joining us again today on legalizefreedom.com.
Well, thank you, Greg. Thanks again for having me.